forward. So we've been picking apart what happened in San Francisco, how they can go forward, and already there's a few things that are sort of rising to the top, Courtney. And number one is, I believe the consensus is that most Vikings fans feel like they should draft a quarterback this year in the first round. I want to talk today about the path to getting over the hump. That was something that Mike Zimmer talked about, saying he was talking with Bill Parcells on the phone after losing about how you get over this competitive but not quite good enough to get to the Super Bowl type of thing that the Vikings have been in. And I like to call it, the Marvin Lewis Cincinnati Bengals, where you're good and you're relevant and you've turned around a franchise, but it's never quite good enough to get deep. And there's other examples of this, including Gary Kubiak's Houston Texans teams that had Matt Schaub. And the most obvious answer is always in the quarterback somewhere. And I think what last year we talked about so much was getting the most out of the quarterback. Well, if they get the most out of Kirk Cousins, then they give themselves a chance. I think this year, Courtney, they gave themselves the best version of Kirk Cousins that you could ever have, and it did not get you where you needed to go. Tell me if you agree with that, because that's sort of going to be the basis of how we talk about this entire offseason. Like, do you believe that they missed something? Do you believe they should have done X instead of Z last year that cost them a chance to be a Super Bowl caliber team? Or do you think they did everything they possibly could have for Kirk Cousins and they got a good season out of him, but not a great season, and that's about what is this is his ceiling?
Well, yeah, this is his ceiling. That's where I want to start with this. What we saw in New Orleans was the best possible version of Kirk that you're going to see. Something that I'm not necessarily sure is a consistent thing that he can do. Leading a game-winning drive of that great of a magnitude with that high of stakes, I don't know if that's something he can turn in routinely throughout the next phase of his career in what could potentially be the final year in Minnesota, or could potentially be one of maybe 2 or 3, however many more years, if he does indeed get that extension this offseason. I'll start back with that. To me, going into the Saints game, and I've said this for months, maybe even for just about a year now, that all Kirk needed to do was the one thing he hadn't done yet in his career, and that's win a playoff game in order for him to get the extension, for them to say, hey, you got to this quote-unquote next level, which is what Gary was talking about this offseason, Mike Zimmer, Rick Spielman, Kirk himself. And that was cracking the notion that he is an average quarterback, that he's a 500 quarterback, which he himself admitted to being. I think he did that this year. I think the numbers speak to it all throughout the season, that he had some very good moments. He had an incredible stretch in October, albeit against some not so great competition, but he still handled business and he did what he had to do. But the moments that you always knew would pop back up did. And it was kind of like clockwork. And so when I look at this situation of where this team can go, and yeah, you're right, it typically does, that conversation does center around the quarterback. It feels to me, and kind of the reaction I've been getting on social media from Vikings fans as we've done all this year-end work and are kind of beginning to pick apart, okay, well, what's next, is that this might be the ceiling under Mike Zimmer. If you are going to have the same approach where you are putting your foot down, nothing changes with this offense, same scheme, same play call, same design, same everything, then I don't know that you can get better than where you're at right now. Because, and this goes beyond, and I'm sure we'll get into this over the next 2 hours, like beyond the run first mentality, like you got to have something else. Because if you have a quarterback that you have basically schemed away from having to win you games outside of the one chance he did that successfully in New Orleans, because he was asked to do it in Seattle and couldn't do it. And there were other instances of it as well, but those two stand out the most. If you don't have that guy who can get you over the hump, then this is what you're going to get.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to compete for a Super Bowl with Kirk Cousins in his final season, you have to go 13-3 or 14-2, and you have to
get a 1 seed, right? Or a 2 seed.
You have to be the best team or the second best team in the entire NFC. And that is not an easy task. It's not an impossible task, though. With the roster that they sent out this year, this was a roster that very easily could have produced that type of season based on how easy the schedule was. Brought it up a number of times, but it's Pro Football Reference has it as one of the 10 easiest schedules the Vikings have ever had in their entire history as a franchise. Next year, that is unlikely to be the case, that you go back-to-back years. It's maybe once a decade you end up with a schedule that was as easy as the Vikings, and yet every time they faced the challenge in the regular season, they fell apart. So even if they won the one game in the playoffs, you look at all those other times and go, that's where your major regret should be, because that cost you a home playoff game. I totally believe that Kirk Cousins could go all the way to the Super Bowl if they had home field throughout. Because, I mean, A, he's more comfortable there. The noise is not an issue there. I don't think that bothers him a ton, but more than anything, it's just the other teams have it really hard when they go up against you, as we saw the Vikings trying to travel out to San Francisco. So if you're already gassed and coming to Minnesota, there's a chance that the Vikings could go to the Super Bowl. So the question you're asking is, can they be the first or second best team in the NFC next year? Or how do you get there? Or can that even happen with Kirk Cousins as your quarterback? And when we were talking about getting him even to 10 wins as being a pretty major victory for him to have a winning season, that's where the formula really struggles to add up, because bad Kirk can't show up 5 different times in a season. Mm-hmm. And even in his best career season, as you mentioned, best by a lot under this system and under Kevin Stefanski, there were still 5 games where he did not show up, and you end up going 10-6 on the season. Or even if they had been 11-5, it would be the same sort of result. You're playing on wild card weekend, and it's great to see Tennessee where they are. They're probably a stronger team than 9-7. They'll probably lose to Kansas City, and we'll end up with a 1 or a 2 versus a 1 or a 2, just as we always do every single year. So I've changed the way that I look at things. I've been looking at things in the years past of, you get to the playoffs and see what happens. But I don't want to look at it that way anymore with so much evidence. Even if Tennessee wins, there's still so much evidence to say that's the outlier. It's almost impossible to do. You have to be one of the 2 best teams in your conference. So if you're saying, how could we fix this going forward? How can you get better? You should look through it the lens of, can you get to the 1 or a 2 seed with this team, with this quarterback? And again, if you're considering signing them to a contract extension, that's what you should be asking yourself. Can this quarterback get us to a 1 or 2 seed at any point in a 5-year contract extension or a 3-year contract extension? And if the answer is no, then you have to go with someone else.
Yeah. And I mean, I am cautious to believe that they're going to go and draft a quarterback. And I know that this is so many months away.
I am too.
But you think about how many other needs there are this offseason for this team, which, for a team that's kind of handicapped itself with the salary cap just based on Kirk's contract initially in 2018 and the implications that was going to give you in 2020, once the new league starts, basically 2 months from today. Like, I know that they can unload a bunch of defensive contracts and move on from guys and everything else, but it still makes it tough. So when you're looking at the offensive line and you're looking at how you're going to replace cornerbacks that are, undeniably not going to be here next year, like, that kind of makes you think, okay, well, your first round pick is at 25. You're probably not getting a quarterback at that. It's kind of an outlier that you'd get somebody right away that could, learn on. I mean, it would certainly need to take a year under Kirk and all that, but I just think there's too many other needs. If I'm like dissecting this right now, trying to figure out what's going to happen, I just feel like they saw enough to think, hey, we can. I mean, and I don't necessarily agree with this logic, but just from what Mike Zimmer was saying, and kind of if you're taking his words at face value, we're a few more pieces away. Well, a few more pieces is probably fixing the offensive line. How many times have we heard that? How many times have we heard, they're just an interior lineman away.
It's hard.
It's very hard. I know people say quarterback is the hardest position to evaluate as a scout. I think offensive line is either 1A or 1B there, because the offensive line got better this year because the scheme made it look better. The personnel didn't get better. I really don't believe that. And, just with where this team's at right now, I just don't know how you can expect them to be more than where they were. That the ceiling becomes a 1-win playoff team in the wild card round, and the reality probably looks like a 9-7 or an 8-8 team. It just feels like regression is inevitable with this team because it took so much for them to get there at this point in 2019 that if you're saying you're not going to change anything, then this is what you should expect year in and year out.
Yeah, that you're probably looking at this being as good as you can be. with this coach and this quarterback and this current structure and this current system and offense. And you could say, well, yeah, but they were right there in a couple of the games. Well, that's kind of the point, is that it's always been with Cousins. Well, yeah, you're always there in the games and you don't always come away with them. It was the same in 2018 with Cousins, where there were a number of different opportunities to get over the top there. I agree with you that the odds do not speak to them drafting a quarterback this year. If anything, with people's jobs still on the line, which even though they'll sign the coach and GM to a contract extension, their jobs are on the line next year. All that hot seat talk that you reported on and this show talked about a lot with Mike Zimmer, it was all real from ownership. If they had gotten beat by 30 points in New Orleans, we would have been talking about a coaching search. I truly believe that. So this changed everything for a week that they won in New Orleans. But we went right back to, well, if you don't get them over the hump and if you don't appear in a Super Bowl and so forth at some point, then they'll move on, just like every other ownership moves on from every coach. So if you're looking at it through that lens and you're Mike Zimmer, you want a cornerback and not a quarterback drafted in the first round, because you want to be able to plug somebody right into a spot there, or because you don't have the money to spend like crazy on whoever the number one free agent cornerback is going to be out there. And more likely than not, I would say they let Trey Waynes go, or definitely let Xavier Rhodes go. So you're looking for two new starting outside corners.
Potentially I think McKenzie's leaving before anybody else.
Yeah, McKenzie, right.
I think last season was handled.
I think he'll be gone too. So you're gonna be talking about a little bit of a forest through the trees situation. See, Mike Zimmer's going to look at the trees and he's going to be saying, well, we need a corner and we need another corner and we need another corner and we need, how about a defensive tackle who could put some darn pressure on the quarterback? And how about this? How about re-signing Anthony Harris because he's got all these interceptions? But the trees, the forest, I mean, is, hey, can you really win with this quarterback, or has he kind of put a cap on where you can go? And he's Alex Smith in that way, I think, where he's good and very good sometimes, great, but probably puts a cap on where you can go. So is Mike Zimmer involved then in this draft the same way he has been before?
I mean, I think so. I think he'd have to be. I don't think he wants to be a coach who doesn't have control over the roster, or at least what he believes is control over the roster and making some of those personnel decisions. But the way I think you have to look at it is quarterback is just not the priority right now. It's in terms of what you're going to draft for. I mean, you're not going to be tanking for Trevor next year, but you might be in position to get, I don't know why I'm so skeptical right now. Maybe it's just because it's the end of the season. It's kind of the fatigue of it. Maybe I need to go on a break like Mike Zimmer's giving his coaches for the week and then reconvene and reevaluate. But I don't see this team as getting back to where they were this year next year. And I don't know if I believe it's just because of the quarterback or because of all the other deficiencies, but I think that they are going to be so up against it in the draft and picking where they are at 25 that you're not going to be able to have all of these immediate plug and play players that are going to be able to be that one or two pieces away that Mike Zimmer talked about in getting this team back to where it needs to be. Truthfully, I think you need a shakeup again, which sucks. I get it. That really is hard for a coaching staff. But to me, outside of Kirk, outside of the struggles on defense and all that happened, I think this scheme was good. Was it great? Probably not. Did it get you 13 play action touchdown passes from Kirk? Yeah. You don't have to do that, though, necessarily through this exact thing. I think the fact that he is so doubling down on wanting to remain the zone-based scheme that's predicated off a run-first mentality and then play action passes with Kirk, but all centered around Dalvin Cook, who has not stayed healthy entirely for a full 16-game season. That, to me, when I was watching that game on Saturday, I go back to Green Bay. And then beyond that, I go back to what happened in the second half in Seattle. And then beyond that, I go back to what happened in Chicago and in Green Bay the first time.
Yep.
If you cannot break away from that mold, the best teams, yes, Tennessee has a run-first mentality. They also have Derek freaking Henry. And Ryan Tannehill has been playing like an MVP caliber quarterback since week 7. If you start in week 1, they're a 13-3 team.
Yeah.
Facts.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it. And that's my issue. That the scheme they have themselves here and the fact that they are so chained to it makes them set themselves up for failure going into next year. That's why it's going to be an 8-8 or 9-7 season next year. Not just on Kirk, not just on a regressing defense that they're going to be trying to piecemeal and potentially build out through the draft that might not be able to be ready to where they were at a few years ago to get back there. It's the scheme itself. And that's what terrifies me when I look at this offensive coordinator search and what they're potentially going to do, because I don't think that running this exact same system is going to get you beyond the ceiling of where you were at this year.
See, I think that whether you run this system or John DeFilippo comes back and puts in the spread offense again, or whether Bill Walsh rises up from the grave and drops down here with Joe Montana to help Kirk Cousins.
I get it. I mean,
you're going to end up
your
with probably
limitations
the
are your
same
quarterback.
results.
Yeah,
Right,
that's true. But
and they had to do everything they could to put Cousins in a bubble. Let's call it the play action bubble, to where it was so reliant on play action shots down the field because he can't be a straight drop quarterback. And when I see on Twitter, and I appreciate these comments about the offensive line and need to improve it, and I do not disagree. I really don't. I don't disagree that it was a problem, the problem, as usual, that they couldn't protect Kirk. But when you have a guy who has never really been capable of being out of the shotgun and just taking the snap and making plays, or straight drop back, like at some point in the playoffs that you have to win a game that way, because it's not going to be handed to you. Guess what? The other team's good at football. Like, well, they just had a good defensive line. All right, let's find all the crappy defensive lines in the playoffs. Sorry, those ones don't get there.
But I do think, just to interrupt there, like the same issues that popped up last year, like the Mike Zimmer was kind of frank about it, that the scheme helped the offensive line. Yeah, because they're going one way and Kirk's going the other.
Yeah, it did. But there's just only so many times you can do that.
Kirk out of the shotgun this year, I looked at these stats the other day because I was curious. He had a 53 total QBR out of the shotgun. That's 17th in the NFL. So kind of meh. Like not great.
Yep.
But he took 223 snaps. Passing attempt. He had 223 passing attempts out of the shotgun. So to say he wasn't a shotgun quarterback, I just don't necessarily buy that.
But he wasn't great
at it
because
he had a 64% completion percentage, and he threw 9 touchdowns and 3 interceptions out of that. He's not good when he has a face of pressure, whether it's coming up through the middle or coming from the edge. And if you don't scheme him away from that, like if that's your only way to get him successful is to put him on the run and to get him on the other side of the field where the defensive line's going the other way, like that's not sustainable. Like not having somebody who can perform in the shotgun routinely and be a drop back offense routinely. I'm not saying you have to get into a drop back game every time to win. You're throwing 70% of the time. I'm not saying that, but
at some point you do, though.
Yes.
At some point you do to win. I mean,
it's not an anomaly.
When Kansas City gets down 24-0, from the time that they were down 24-0 to the time they're leading, they ran the football one time, and it was at the goal line. And there was no play action. It was your quarterback has to take snaps and make plays. That's the only way to win. When you get down in San Francisco 17-10, the only way to win is probably going to be a shotgun, take the snap, throw the ball type of thing. And that's where Tom Brady over his career was so excellent, was taking the snap, diagnosing where he needed to go, get rid of the ball, throw it accurately. Cousins too often has this hesitation in his game that has always exists, this slight tick slower than other quarterbacks getting the ball out there. And that's where he makes his offensive line worse. And we always focus on, well, this guy wasn't perfect, and this guy wasn't perfect, and this guy wasn't perfect. And then you ask, well, who's on the Kansas City offensive line? Mitchell Schwartz, their right tackle, is fantastic. But I mean, it's not Orlando Pace and Will Shields and Darmani Dawson. And, it's not like the 92 Cowboys offensive line. It's a good offensive line, probably better than the Vikings, but it's a quarterback who can make plays. And it's a quarterback who can thrive in that atmosphere that usually takes it to win. And that's why you ask, is there any formula where you can put together enough players and enough talent around Kirk Cousins and enough system and enough scheme and enough trickery and everything else to actually win? And with the contract that he has, I say there isn't. If he did not have that contract, I would say possibly. But
you're asking for perfection, Matthew.
That's what it has to be to win with Cousins. It has to be absolutely perfect. And it was as close as it'll ever get this year.
And I agree with that. So it's like, where do you go from here? People, I love that, we're getting a bunch of good answers right now because I was asking people on Twitter, and please keep sending these in, what your biggest concerns are for the offseason. But even if you do draft a quarterback, let's say they get one, I don't know, you could get a third rounder. I don't know if he'll ever pan out, but you could get a third rounder this year, maybe thinking, okay, for the backup option, or if you have to start grooming somebody, okay. But is he going to play in 2020? Probably not, because of the justification of a $30 million cap hit, roughly.
It would be
and benching
it's Cousins no matter what next year.
Yes, like that's. Yep. I don't know. I'm at a loss here because it's like it's Cousins or it's not. Like that's it. Like he is playing next year. He is the starting quarterback. That would be catastrophically awful optics to bench him next year.
Oh yeah, that's not
going to happen. Yep. But it's also to expect that the quarterback play is going to all of a sudden get that much better because you're keeping the same scheme. I think is just kind of short-sighted.
No, it's definitely not going to get better than it was this year. By every single metric across the board, this was Kirk Cousins' best season. And there's a reason why it's a career year, because it probably won't happen again. Mm-hmm. He could be good, but it probably won't be exactly the same. And when you have the cover band version of what Stefanski was doing, there's no guarantee that you're going to have the exact same success and the exact same chemistry with the play caller and with the quarterback. So I was looking at this, though, because you mentioned drafting quarterbacks, and I'll give this to you now, and then maybe after the break we can sort of talk about this. But if it were this year, they were drafting the third best quarterback in the draft, would that be something that you would like?
And that would be, so we're saying Joe Burrow is going to Cincinnati.
Of course, and Tua is going to be gone. I don't know who the third best quarterback is. I mean, we'll find out through draft season, the combine, everything else.
So it'd be the guy from Oregon, essentially. Maybe. Let's just go ahead and say that.
I'm not a huge fan, but maybe. Let's just say. But just historically, I want to look at the third best quarterback that was drafted. And we could talk about sort of your odds. So I'm going to go through these. Let's start with 2008. Just a sort of arbitrary place that will give us about, 9 or 10 of these. So Brian Brohm was the third quarterback, drafted behind Matt Ryan and Joe Flacco. Josh Freeman was the third quarterback in 2009 behind Matt Stafford and Mark Sanchez. Jimmy Clausen was the third quarterback drafted in 2010. It's not going well so far. Blaine Gabbert was the third quarterback in 2011. Again, it is not going so good. Now, Ryan Tannehill, who maybe if he wasn't coached by Adam Gase would have been a lot better. Jury's still out, I guess, on Ryan Tannehill, if he's really this good or not. 2012. But you'd take it.
Yeah.
Because he's
going to get a massive extension anyways, because that's the same thing. You take it. When you see it, you take it.
Even Dolphins, Ryan Tannehill got them to the playoffs and is probably as good as Kirk or somewhere in that ballpark, like in that middle tier, but it wouldn't cost you anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So there's the first one. It took us a few years. There's the first one you'd take. Mike Glennon was the third quarterback in 2013, and let's pass on that one. Teddy Bridgewater in 2014. Of course, you would take that. In 2015, Garrett Grayson, third quarterback off the board. I don't know.
Play?
He's somebody.
Anywhere?
Paxton Lynch in 2016.
Yeah, Gary would nix that one.
Deshaun Watson in 2017, but only because Ryan Pace is a hysterical fool. So there's one you'd take, 2017. 2018, Josh Allen. Of course, you should have taken Lamar Jackson. And last year, Dwayne Haskins, which we don't know whether Dwayne Haskins will be good or not. So I guess the point is, drafting a quarterback sounds great, and I think I'm for it, but the third quarterback off the board historically, pretty woof.
Yeah. And I mean, do you think even this year that the third quarterback would get to Minnesota at 25?
Good question.
I don't know.
Depends on how good they think he is as a prospect. I just don't know.
But there's 24 other teams before them.
Yeah.
That could think differently.
A lot of quarterback shuffling.
Yeah. And I mean, there's, teams that are going to move up. There's teams that are going to want to move back in the first round. Honestly, at this point, I mean, when you're 25, you're kind of in draft purgatory, because it's like you could spend that on, you could maybe get a second rounder outside of the top 15. Those guys are probably all second round grades, or at least low first round. So, I mean, I don't know. I think to even think that they would draft one is such a far-fetched idea, at least right now. It's January 14th. I mean, that could change. But I think this is if you're a Vikings fan, you got to realize this is probably what you're stuck with for the next. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just don't I'm not in the camp of believing it's going to get that much better. I think what you see is what you get. And with the offense, what you saw this year is what you're going to get next year, according to everything Mike Zimmer said yesterday.
He wants you to.
He wants you to believe it's going to be the exact same thing. But I just don't know the whole notion that, we're a couple pieces away. Well, where? Like, I mean, you tried to fix the offensive line this year. I mean, there are ways to fix the interior even more, probably pretty drastic, because you'd be cutting players, which might be the way to go. But financially, it's going to be tough. Draft capital wise, it's going to be tough because you're probably spending that 25th pick on a corner if we're just being honest with ourselves right now.